Whip.
Madam President, I got home last night, or at least got back to Washington last night at midnight, after completing a whirlwind trip of 3 days to Lithuania. Went there in a bipartisan delegation to be present for the NATO Summit. It was an historic meeting. President Biden was there. The leaders of many countries from around the world, not just the NATO allies, but for instance, the President of the Republic of South Korea and the Prime Minister from Australia. What brought them all together was an historic event. The NATO alliance, which has been in existence for over 70 years, was created after World War II to bring peace to at least the European and American region of the world. It has been successful because we gathered nations, now 31, together in common purpose to fight off anyone who would attack us, to let those who were thinking of attacking us know the heavy price they would pay. So the message from Vilnius, Lithuania, to Vladimir Putin this week is not a good one for him. The message is that the NATO alliance is bigger, stronger, and more unified than it ever has been in history. And in a way, it's kind of a surprise. Wasn't it long ago that the previous president, Donald Trump, raised enough questions among leaders in the world they wondered if there would be a NATO? Trump, of course, was a close friend, I still can't understand why, with Vladimir Putin, often finding him so admirable and praising him for his crazy politics. And yet, when it came to the NATO alliance, President Trump was very critical, to the point where when Joseph Biden became president of the United States and started meeting with world leaders, the first question they asked is, well, what is the position of the United States when it comes to this common security alliance? Biden assured him that it was strong and would continue to be, and he's proven it. What's happened in Lithuania at the NATO summit this week is a tribute to leadership by many people, not the least of which is our president. He came together and understood that we're stronger when we stand together, and we saw it in Vilnius. The situation that we witnessed yesterday was historic. My mother was born in that little country of Lithuania many years ago and immigrated to the United States at the age of 2. I've been back many times. My first visit was in 1979, before I was elected to Congress. I'm glad I went. It was good for me to see what Lithuania looked like in Soviet times and to see the sharp contrast today with modern Lithuania. It's just plain historic that a NATO summit would be held in that same former Soviet Socialist Republic this year, 2023. That summit was hosted in Lithuania because of that country's extraordinary journey from Soviet tyranny to a thriving democratic voice. Knowing Putin's tyranny all too well, Lithuania has been an outspoken supporter of Ukraine, despite the invasion by Putin, as well as a supporter of the exiled voices from Belarus and Russia. And it stood firm against Chinese economic bullying resulting from growing trade with Taiwan. It brought back to mind what I witnessed over the years, is that former Soviet Socialist Republic was literally the first republic to step forward and say, we're breaking with Moscow. We want our own independence. They paid a heavy price: pressure, killing, invasion, all of the things with Gorbachev and the Soviet leaders could conjure up to try to stop this little country from seceding. But they failed. Lithuania is a proud nation now, and I'm glad that it hosted this NATO summit. We saw at this summit an amazing array of international leaders, including Asian allies like Australia and South Korea, as well as our own President and Secretary of State, Tony Blinken. What struck me was the sustained resolve and common purpose in defeating Russia in their war with Ukraine. Our NATO allies, many former captives of the Soviet Union themselves, have enduring memories of war and are determined to not allow Russia's imperial actions of today. I want to recognize President Joe Biden's clear-eyed vision and leadership in galvanizing and reinvigorating the critical NATO alliance and its support for Ukraine. The chairs of our journey, the NATO observers from the Senate, were Jean Shaheen of New Hampshire, Tom Tillis of North Carolina. They did an admirable job, and I was glad to be part of their effort. We must never forget that NATO was formed from the ashes of two horrific wars in Europe, with many newer members eventually joining after decades of Soviet oppression. And despite Putin's warped paranoia to the contrary, NATO is not a threat to Russia, but it will defend every inch of member territory from Russia or any other such attack. The alliance is still growing, with this summit's newest member, Finland, and now Sweden on the way. Putin's colossal strategic blunder in Ukraine has cost the lives of more than 100,000 Russian soldiers, and it lowered Russia's standing in the world. Much to his disappointment, Putin's senseless invasion, in fact, strengthened and expanded the NATO alliance, including along hundreds of miles of Russian border. There were a few other key summit outcomes, notably further security guarantees to Ukraine and an easier pathway for Ukraine to ultimately be a part of NATO, which I hope they will be. I believe Ukraine's future rests ultimately within NATO, and until then, the United States and our allies must continue to support its defense against Russia. I think Lithuanian President Nausėda argued this well. Europeans understand that Ukraine's fight is their fight. That also is my feeling, and most of those in the Senate, both political parties. Ukraine's fight for democracy and sovereignty is our fight too. In Vilnius, we also met with Belarusian opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. Her husband Sergei was jailed when trying to run in an election against Belarusian strongman Alexander Lukashenko, the last dictator in Europe. So she ran in his place and probably won, but Lukashenko refused to honor the election results. She had to flee to neighboring Lithuania. Her country has become a puppet state of Putin, even allowing Russia to move nuclear weapons into its territory. Countless Belarusians have been jailed for demanding basic freedoms, and yet she and so many others heroically continue the struggle, including some who are fighting to help Ukraine. This poster shows two jailed Belarusian journalists who work for Radio Free Europe, which is doing very heroic quality journalism in the region. Andrei Kuznechik and Ihar Lozik. Both were jailed by Lukashenko for simply being reporters. They and all the country's political prisoners should be released, period. I also hope the administration will soon announce a new special envoy for Belarus, and I'll work with my Senate colleagues to update and strengthen the Belarus Democracy Act. I want to close with a message to Vladimir Putin from the summit. The NATO alliance is stronger than ever, and we are united in our determination to stop your ruthless invasion of Ukraine. Madam President, I ask consent to place the following statement in a separate part in the record.
Without objection.
Yesterday, the Associated Press published a series of articles detailing a range of ethical failures by the Supreme Court of the United States. The reports detailed justices' involvement in fundraising at colleges and universities, the use of Supreme Court staff members to push sales of books, donor-funded teaching positions that double as all expense-paid vacations. The Supreme Court is now on recess, at home with their families and traveling on vacation. I wish them many sunny days, but even if the sun's shining, there's still a shadow over the Supreme Court. So for several months now, there's been a steady flow of reports documenting how the members of our nation's highest court have failed to live up to the public trust that they have been given. Justice Clarence Thomas has traveled the world on billionaire Harlan Crow's yacht and private jet. Crow bought the home of Justice Thomas's mother and allowed her to continue living there rent-free. He even paid for the education of Justice Thomas's minor relative. None of this was included in Justice Thomas's financial disclosure forms. Then we learned that Justice Samuel Alito took an all-expense-paid luxury fishing trip to Alaska. He traveled there on a private jet of billionaire hedge fund manager Paul Singer and stayed at the fishing lodge of conservative donor Robin Arkley. Justice Samuel Alito didn't disclose any of it to the public. In fact, he dismissed when it was discovered one trip on a private jet, saying that didn't really count because, in fact, the seat on the jet would have been empty if he didn't sit in it. What an argument from a Supreme Court justice. The solution to the problems we're seeing at the Supreme Court is a simple one. They need, like every other court in America, to adopt an enforceable code of ethics. Every federal judge in the country is bound by a code of ethical conduct and a set of ethics rules and enforcement mechanisms, except for the 9 justices of the Supreme Court who sit across the street from this building. I first urged Chief Justice Roberts to adopt a binding, enforceable code of conduct over 11 years ago. Sadly, he didn't accept my suggestion, and he continues to ignore the issue today. This is the John Roberts Court. It will go down in history as the John Roberts Court. He has the power, and I believe the moral obligation, to straighten up this mess and restore the integrity of the court. When the court reconvenes in October, there's a tradition for someone to announce, oyez, 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 this honorable court. How can they call it an honorable court in light of these disclosures? I honestly believe, Madam President, that before they broke for this vacation period, that Justice Roberts would announce reforms that really count and finally start to restore the integrity and reputation of the court. But so far, nothing. Next week, the Senate Judiciary Committee, which I chair, will vote on the Supreme Court Ethics Recusal and Transparency Act. This bill, introduced by Senator Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island, would require the Supreme Court to adopt an enforceable code of conduct. It would also add new recusal and transparency requirements under the federal law. The legislation does not distinguish between justices appointed by a Democratic president or a Republican president. It requires a code of conduct enforceable against all justices. I was disappointed to learn today that one of the Republican leaders has publicly come out in opposition to any enforceable code of ethics established by the Judiciary Committee on the U.S. Supreme Court. What is he thinking? We live by those standards of disclosure and limitation and enforcement of ethics. And despite our unpopularity in many public opinion polls, think about if this Congress lived by the same standard or lack of standards as the U.S. Supreme Court. By making sure the highest court in the land doesn't have the lowest ethical standards, our legislation will be a key first step in restoring confidence in the Supreme Court. The markup will be next week. I sincerely hope before that time, Chief Justice Roberts will step up and accept the responsibility for his Supreme Court to establish credible standards of integrity. And I yield the floor.